All right, and we're hitting the transition button. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk about another one of these car movies. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we like to talk about games, but also car movies. And I'm so excited to talk about this one because honestly, it has had I've had a rocky relationship with Too Fast, Too Furious.
Really? I don't understand how it's Rocky because pre-spoilers, I guess, for a 19-year-old movie. This movie can almost drink. I thought it was really bad.
See, I think pretty good, but like the first time I saw it, I thought it was pretty bad, and and it took me. What it really was when I first watched it. Okay, I'm so excited to talk about this because this is a very recent revelation. The first time I watched it, I was like just getting into these movies. So I watched the first one, and then I watched Too Fast, Too Furious, and then I watched Tokyo Drift. And Tokyo Drift was where I like turned on. I was like, oh, oh, this is really fun. I like these. Oops, I like these. But then very recently, like a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I went back and I watched Too Fast, Too Furious, and I did not realize how well crafted I think it is. Which is such a weird fucking thing to say, but I actually
I
think
don't
that the
understand what you're
plotting
talking about.
of this movie is really well done in such a way that I can't help but enjoy it quite a lot.
So the big thing for me is there are plot holes that like you could drive an entire semi truck through, right? None of anything that's happening makes sense, and there's lots of unearned things, and that was too much for me to like hold on
And
to.
that's interesting. I am down to talk about some of that stuff. The thing that I'm mostly interested in, what is predictably for me, I guess, are the stakes, right? And how the movie has ramping element as it just keeps layering more and more kind of like stakes and threats and obstacles in front of our heroes to kind of make them conquer, which it is well known to be the kind of shit that I am into, right? Like the
Sure.
stuff that makes me look in at the window with a shirt that says sickos and go, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there's definitely parts of this that like I could like the very beginning of the movie. I was like, wow, the acting's bad. And I quickly forgot about that, which is fine. Like there are forgivable problems here that like I'll try not to harp on too much, but like it's got a lot of problems. The plot doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, and also I couldn't get over. So this is a line I thought of that I'm going to say now is one of the effects of NOS is apparently turning your car into a 3D model, which like you spoke about this in the last one. It's like
Yep.
actually in most of like the actual plot scenes, the 3D modeling isn't so apparent. But in the two drag races, it's very apparent and very bad. It's
Yep.
like I get that cornering's dangerous, but like they very obviously like put 3D models in, right? Like I don't know who they thought they were gonna fool, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it is like a movie from like 2002, so I feel like
yeah,
it has that. I feel like it has that like that age on it, right? In a way that is so noticeable now.
yeah. I mean, I
But it is definitely
almost,
part of like the CGI cars suck phenomenon that people complain about.
I honestly think it might have been more forgivable if they were all always CG, because then you could be like, oh, I guess it's like what they're doing with this, I guess. But you could tell they knew it sucked because they only did it for like dangerous cornering shots where they only showed like a corner of the car, and you could still tell it was very clearly a CGI car, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think the best moments in the movie are outside of the context of those races, where it is, like they're driving on the highway, right? Like that stuff is great. They drive the boat into the car, or the car into the boat, right? Like that's real, that's
yeah,
practical, and that's the stuff that works, right? But I
yeah,
definitely do agree that just from like a raw, like I don't know, like action perspective, CGI cars suck and are not fun, and yeah.
yeah. And so I mean, you kind of put a little spoiler in there, so we'll put the spoiler tag here. Um, Just because, like, I want to make clear that, like, when I say their plot, there's some like very obvious things that bothered me, but I'm not like there are a lot of little things that I'm willing to forgive, right? Like the car could just happen to hit the boat. Unlikely, fine, right? Like the other thing that really got me at the very beginning of the movie, in that first drag race, it's like, wait, he won't let them race unless there's 4 of them, and then he calls in his friend, but then his friend says, who's Brian, right? Brian says, let's up the bet. And the one guy's like, I don't want to do that. He's like, well, you can go home then. It's like, well, you just said that you couldn't race without 4 people. If he backs off the line, is the race not happening then? And then also kind of like at the end of that race when he like raises the fucking drawbridge, is like, if I were in that race for money, I'd be like, I did not fucking sign up for this. This is a fucking piece of shit, right? Like, I'm not giving you my fucking prize money.
You watch it trash the cars, right?
Right.
Because they're these insanely low-riding cars, and I guess it's Suki's car who goes up and over the bridge and just like gets absolutely demolished coming in.
Yeah, I mean, and like, but for that bridge rise, Brian maybe doesn't win, right? Yeah. Like, it's like real close in the end, but like, the lead car, like, him leaping it, that's pretty cool. But like, part of it too is that the second place guy, or the would have been second place guy, like loses control after that, right? Like, and this is not good faith and fair dealing. Not,
yep. Especially because Brian plays it in the moment like he has outsmarted the guy, when realistically speaking, he didn't know that. He didn't know that the drawbridge was going up. Which, to be fair, like, I would make the argument that responding to the unknown is part of what makes a good player or whatever. And like, yes, obviously Brian is doing the thing from the first movie. Well, this is all spoilers talk, I guess. So
I put I intended to.
Yeah. So like, I appreciate that it is a callback to that first movie.
And it foreshadows the boat ramp, right? Like that's
yeah.
And hey, like I said, that's dumb, but that's not the thing that bothers me, right? That's the thing that's like, oh, this is a dumb action movie, right? Like these are
okay.
things.
So what are the real plot holes though? That's what I'm really interested in.
So the big ones are the big ones are like, it's kind of like, well, first of all, some of this is just kind of like, maybe I know just a little bit too much about the criminal justice system, but it's like, as soon as they hand over the money to the undercover drivers, that's the game. They don't need them to drive it like anywhere, right? Like they'd be like this is, you have like literally committed an act in furtherance of a conspiracy, right? Like you have broken down like they should have let the local cops make the arrest, right? And like, this is the other one too, right? Like, they know the specific guy who is on the take, right? And even if they are afraid that, like, there's other people on the take in the organization, they can go to that guy and be like, we will put your wife and kids in witness protection program. Just call them off for the 15 minutes like he wants you to, so our mission can go through, right? Like, none of this makes any sense. None of this makes sense in terms of, like, how you would actually do it, like, making sure that, like, this goes smoothly, right? And that's fine. Or, these are the things that bother me, right? Like, in terms of, like, an action movie thing, like, whatever, but it's so glaring to me, it's like, why are they doing any of this?
They're doing it to up the stakes, Mango. Okay? To make it,
raise
the stakes higher.
Why do all, like, 100 fucking drivers agree to fucking help Brian with this thing? Because they're all good.
Because it's a fucking sweet moment. This is the part where I think, so I guess really my big thing, people really like the first one and tend to shit on Too Fast, Too Furious, which makes me want to come to its rescue in a way, because I think Too Fast, Too Furious is better than The Fast and the Furious, even though obviously I like the one, it establishes all the world building, we talked about it however many weeks ago, right? Like, it has maybe my favorite line that I quote all the time. You can have any brew in the house as long as it's a Corona, right? Like, all of these things are established, and Too Fast, Too Furious has basically none of them. The only thing it has is the chemistry between Brian O'Connor, Roman Pierce, and Tej, and that's kind of it.
That was the other. Which one is Tej the woman?
No. Tej is
okay, yeah. Okay,
the woman is Ava Mendes. She is Monica.
All right. Does she come back at any point?
Yes, but like not in a really real way.
That's fine. The thing about her, like, her and Brian's romance doesn't make any sense, right? Like, it's like totally unearned, and like her plot critical role doesn't make any sense in the story. That was the thing that that was one of the things that really got me, because she I get her showing up on the boat to be like, hey, he's gonna try and kill you, right? Like that makes sense. It's like a cop plot point. But then them kissing, right? Like why, right? Like that doesn't there's I mean, I guess you
Exactly, because all of his chemistry is with Roman because they're they're gay lovers, Mango.
and
I do want
and
to talk about the homosexual subtext. Actually, technically, it would be bisexual
so
subtext.
the
But
Asian woman to the asshole guy says bend over and then rear ends his car in the opening race.
yeah, like I do think that the bisexual reading of Too Fast Too Furious is very like legitimate, right? And I actually think that it actually improves the movie by quite a bit, right? Essentially with the understanding of, if you imagine Brian O'Connor and Roman Pierce to be two bisexual men, right? And who had a breakup because, and they mentioned a little bit later down the line, Tanya, they had a breakup because Brian had commitment issues and he had this wandering eye for women, which is why Roman is so fucking jealous of Brian like giving the eyes to Ava Mendez's character and everything. And I think
Wait,
all of that
so
stuff like
are you saying he gets so mad that he steals 4 cars and gets himself arrested, and that's like
well, like honestly, so there's also like that sort of subtext to it, right? Like one of the things that I think keeps Too Fast Too Furious out of bad territory. Realistically speaking, I think the movie is fine, right? When I was talking about Marvel movies last week, I talked about there are the good ones, there are fine ones, and then there are bad ones. Realistically, Too Fast Too Furious is really just fine, right? And it's not even that fine. It's kind of middle fine, right?
I would say I'm going to disagree with you hard here. I'm going to say it's a bad movie, but it's a bad movie that is fun enough to transcend its badness, right? Like from a core
Okay.
kind of how you talk about movies that are objectively that you like better than they are objectively
Yes.
quality. Like I think the objective quality of this movie is very very low, but it's fun enough that it's acceptable. It's like I don't know, I want to say if you imagine these kinds of movies as almost like a U, where they're fun, their fun's here, but their quality's here, right? And The Room or something like that is a big stretch, right? Like you watch that movie because it is very objectively terrible, but it's so fun that it's up there. I think this movie has a smaller curve, but some of the fun isn't just at laughing at it, right? Like a lot of the fun of The Room is laughing at the movie. This
So
movie has some
okay.
legitimately enjoyable action sequences, for instance, right?
Yeah, so I do want to be clear. I am not laughing at this movie, and I do take it seriously, right? Like I buy there's parts of this that I don't necessarily buy, but I buy the core relationship between Brian and Roman, right? And the fact that these are even outside of this bisexual stuff, estranged friends who
Right.
are reconnecting as part of this plot line to infiltrate whatever Verone's operation. I buy that on its own, on its own merits, and I take that sort of drama sincerely, right? And I do think that insofar as it is an action movie, it is sort of like a thriller, you know. A thriller is the wrong title for this, but part of what an action movie is supposed to do is to thrill you, right? There are legitimately really thrilling parts, right? When they're
Sure.
racing to get to the Ferrari, for instance, um, that's a really great moment, right? With a lot of fun and interesting stuff that they're doing with the cars, and all of those stunts are really practical and cool, right? There's the part where Brian, Roman flips Brian off, and then Brian swaps into reverse or whatever, and you can tell that those are real stunts that they pulled on, real highways, basically, right? Um, all of that stuff works, and I think that stuff works on its own merits, such that it gets out of that so bad it's good territory, right? This is not me trying to make a one of those sorts of arguments. I will say though that I think I agree on certain other issues. The things that hold this movie back, right? A lot of the other character relationships and acting, I think, are pretty bad, not great, bad. Some of the characters in here are doing just fine kind of character work, right? Like there's the guy who, there's the FBI handler who's from the first movie. There's the new cop guy who thinks that, like Brian and Roman are gonna run, right? Like those guys tend to do just fine. I think Verone sort of sucks. I think a lot of these other sort of supporting characters around him kind of suck. The only really like kind of quote unquote good actors would be Brian, Roman, and Tej, but they're not even really good actors. They just kind of sell the bromance of like of their relationship well enough. Um, so
So
that's it's stuff like that I think is holding it back, right? Like the editing not being very interesting or dynamic, or doing these weird CGI fly throughs of the cars or whatever. Like I think that stuff sucks. The cinematography is actually weirdly okay, but also mostly it sucks just because it's very straightforward. There's not a lot going on. All of the rooms, it's lit like a Marvel movie basically, right? With
yeah,
just all of the rooms being completely awash in light. There's no shadows anywhere, like that kind of stuff.
it's serviceable but not like impressive.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of like a shame because like the first one wasn't like a cinematic masterpiece or anything, but it did have a significant portion that happens at night that's like lit like night, right? Like
Yep.
whereas like this one, the one night scene is very bright, from what I remember. So yeah, but yeah, so yeah, I just can't come around to say that this is like a good movie, right? Like I can sit here and tell you that if it was on and I wanted to like have some beers while having something stupid on in the background, I'd be fine with it. Even if you were like, we're gonna marathon Fast and the Furious, be like, okay, it's not like it's so bad that like I would like, refuse to watch this entry or whatever, or even hate watch it. But like, it's not gonna be one that I'm gonna be like, this,
Okay.
like, this is a thing that like I would ever. This is the only way I would ever watch this again is in the context of a Fast and Furious marathon.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. That's definitely interesting because that is very much how I felt the first time I watched it. And I sort of wonder if seeing the rest of the movies and kind of soaking in, the later appearances of Roman and Tej as part of the Fast and Furious family have changed that, like have changed the way I come back and watch this, right? Because I was in that same situation when I first watched the movie and I thought it was truly bad. But I also think part of it was I didn't get quite dialed into this, like the stakes right. The most recent time I watched it, I was legitimately like, I've talked about this effect before where you know I'm watching something as I'm doing something else. I'm playing Hearthstone and I have it going on in the background, right? And what's a very common thing for me to do, for instance, for Man of Steel, right? For Man of Steel, which is a movie, I'll watch that in the background all the time. I always get pulled out of it, or pulled out of whatever I'm doing, to focus on the action scenes, because I think the action in that movie is so compelling, right? So you have the fight, Superman versus Zod. I'm gonna watch that blow for blow, shot for shot, every single time, just because like the I think the filmmaking is so good in those action scenes that it is impossible to look away from. And I've described that with other things too, right? Like it was a similar thing with the sight gags in uh Chippendale, right? It was just so full of all of these, little sight gags that I was just sitting there watching the movie, even though I normally would kind of be maybe paying half attention to something like that while I'm doing something on my other screen. The same sort of thing happened to me specifically around the climax, right? Because I was keyed into a lot of little minor details um, in everything that really just sold me on the whole experience, right? The fact that they are undercover, right? So there's the threat that they're going to be discovered at any time. Then, even though they are undercover, you know that they're going to be killed by the guys who show up to get into their cars, right? Just before the end of it, right? And you know that the FBI is expecting them to run, right, at any individual moment. So the FBI are also like breathing down their necks, ready to throw them in jail. And you know that, like, and it's just like this, all of these things are ramping up on top of one another to create this, just like, how are they going to get out of this one feeling, right? Of just like, what are they going to possibly do to outsmart all of these things that are ramping up the kind of the tension and the stakes and the eventual payoff for some of this stuff, right? Like the ejector scene is, and it's just like cool, and it's fun, right? And you can see how those pieces of the puzzle were set up and will pay off later in the in the story, right? They anticipate that there are going to be problems with this heist, which is why they design their cars with they go to Tej and they say, hey, we want to put a bunch of work in to do this, and you watch that work happen. You don't know what it's for yet, but you will eventually learn, oh, it's because they're putting in these fucking ejector seats and all this other sort of stuff. And I just think that on that level, I was very in tune with Too Fast Too Furious on my most recent watch through, which is what elevated it. There's more specifically above the first one, right? For me, even though I still do love the first one or whatever, it's weird. I gotta say, Too Fast Too Furious is better.
I just disagree. 'Cause I think part of it is that it's not like they pay off a ton of these stakes in like a super like you said. Um, so so the big ones are like the bad guy, the FBI, and the kill. I guess right. Is that fair? So the I don't know. I thought that like the ejector sheets were a little bit like too strongly foreshadowed for it to really be a surprise. Like he literally says, "Do you have any half bottles of Nos lying around?" Right? He's like, "We might need to eject some problems later." And it's like the only thing that was surprising about me is that it wasn't more cartoonish. I was expecting like an out the top rather than out the side thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Yeah, actually, the real thing I like about the ejector seats is the tension in the second one, right? Because you have the first one where I think it's Roman does it first, right? Where he ejects his guy, but Brian is hesitating, and that ends up being the right move because they learn that like the rendezvous point is a different location, and they
right.
need to go somewhere else. Um,
That
and
was another little thing, right? Like henchman number 2 should have known something was up when henchman number 1 didn't tell Rome that he needed to pull off at the different point, right? Like everybody should have known something was up, but like they,
Yep.
um, uh, and anyway, continue with what you were saying. I'll get to.
And so to me, it's that stuff. Actually, the other one I really like, I think the one that really got me was the 15-minute window, right? Where you watch the officer who is supposed to give them the 15-minute window say, like all units move on Verone or whatever, and like boom, Brian and Roman are now the getaway drivers with every cop in the city after them at the same time that they're undercover, at the same time that they're, riding with guys who are going to kill them, at the same time that they're going to meet up with Verone, who explicitly wants to kill them, at the same time that the FBI doesn't trust them. It's just like that was the real thing that started the whole, like the whole like clock in my
Okay,
head,
and
just like ticking in time to this movie.
so I get that, and I can see exactly where we diverge, which is because
Yeah.
as that was happening, I was like, why did they not pull this guy and just be like, let it go, right? Like there is like literally no reason for them to let him like they could have set it up in a way that it wasn't like that they didn't have to know it, right? Like you could have done it, right? You could have
Yeah.
there's also a bunch of it feels like there's like a handful of missing scenes, right? Like I feel like there should have been more build up with Brian and the agent's love story, right? I thought that like it almost feels like Rome handing over the last 3 bags is missing a scene where the FBI agent knows that there's an extra 3 bags, is going to throw him in jail if he doesn't do the right thing, right? But that doesn't happen, and it doesn't really make any sense why he hands over the second 3 bags of cash, other than, I guess, to show he's not a bad guy. But then they turns out that they've stuffed their pants with money anyway, right? Like I don't know, like all these little things like took me out of the tense moments. It was like, yeah, okay, it's fun as an action movie, past that, but like I don't know, it felt like, I guess part of it too is like that I just didn't feel a lot of that tension, right? Like jumping the car onto the boat, pretty rad, right? And that felt really good, right? But and like the individual moment to moment stuff felt really good, but like the overall stuff is just kind of like right? Like this does not make any sense to me, and because of that, I am not. Interestingly, this is kind of like I think what you talk about with like the Bathos stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, like that undercuts the tension for you because it makes it less serious, and I've definitely felt that at times too. Um, in the same kind of way, the tension is undercut for me because like some of these things have like obvious solutions that they don't do, and it's like this is hard because it's not just kind of like flawed character stuff, which is like people taking the non-optimal route is not generally a valid criticism to me unless it's very obvious, right? So, um, but but yes, that is kind of like the big stack. I think that's where we really diverge. Like that moment is where we diverge, right? Like you're seeing this tension ramp
See,
up.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because I think it also is the buy. Like we talk about the buy-in factor, right? Where like if you are on board for something, like your sense of your suspension of disbelief is intact. It turns things like all of the cars coming out of that thing. That moment is cool if you're on board. That moment is lame if you're off board,
Yeah,
right? And I think that that's part of what like that's part of how this stuff like comes down. It's also interesting because it is something of a heist movie that is doing heist movie things, but this is actually before Oceans 11, 12, and 13, which like have we ever talked about those on the podcast?
we did in back halves because I watched them all with my family like a
Okay,
year
I
ago.
like
Yeah.
those movies are obviously fantastic, and I love all of them, right? But I think that they have a kind of in the same way that like Lord of the Rings had this genre codifying effect, where it made kind of like story wise, I guess, it sort of like made so many things that came after it like conform to the way that it did things, right? You can see that with the Lord of the Rings trailer, or whatever it's called. I think it's called the Rings of Power trailer for the Amazon series. Like they are just straight up aping the Lord of the Rings movie, which is like fair enough. That movie is those movies are absolutely transcendentally good. So if you're gonna ape something, it would make sense to ape that, right? Um, but I was definitely really interested by how this movie is a heist movie that predates the Oceans movies, which I think would later do a lot of these sort of bait and switches where the main characters are like duping the audience in the same way that they're kind of like duping the cops, um while at the same time predating the genre codifiers of that, which I would say obviously are that Oceans trilogy from the mid 2000s.
See, that is interesting. Okay, this is the same year as the Italian Job remake. I wonder. Um, so that's May 30th, and when is Too Fast, Too Furious? Just because, like, I'm thinking about this, right, and I think you're right, but there's also like an era of heist movies that are in like the 60s, which is like the original Italian Job, and then some ones with like the famous actor. His first name is Red, I think, that I've seen a couple of.
No, there are definitely more of these. Gone in 60 Seconds was another one,
Right.
which I also actually fucking love that movie. That movie is truly stupid, but also very cool.
Oh, you know what this is? This is one of those. This is one of those two studios makes the same movie at the same time. Fucking Too Fast Too Furious comes out 6 days after the Italian Job. Uh, which is another famous like car heist movie. I think I might be having internet problems, so hold. Okay, it looks like you're stabilized. Sorry about that, folks at home. Um,
God, this is gonna make me want to go watch
uh,
uh Gone in 60 Seconds. Let's do it.
yeah, I mean, we've got a whole bunch of these movies to watch, like these like '90s esque aughts movies to watch. We've got to watch that. We've got to watch Hackers. We've got to watch. What was it? What was the other? We were talking about these during the first movie. Um, but yeah. Yep. So, but like, I think part of this too is that like it's kind of also like a shallow movie, maybe, right? Like, we could sit here and talk about like specific scenes for a while, but like, I don't know. It feels like there's not like a lot here. There's not a lot of there as it were. Right.
That is definitely fair. There is really not all that much to outside of this sort of bisexual subtext. that I alluded to before, which is really just taking the earnest. I think we would all agree that this like relationship drama is the kind of emotional core of the movie, right? Roman, like the character arcs that are playing out is Roman and Brian. You know,
So this is a thing that I'm gonna level as a criticism, I guess. Is it's not character arcs; it's one character arc. Paul Walker is always correct, right? Like Rome has to like take responsibility for his actions, right? Because Brian has done no wrong actually in any of this, right? He's always the good guy. He's always right, which maybe isn't a criticism so much as like a plot point or maybe just an interesting one. But like Rome is wrong for having been mad at Brian because he didn't have anything to do with his imprisonment, right? And Rome has to learn how to deal with that. And Rome kind of does that on his own off screen and without any like, and the payoff is like, I'm sorry, Brian. You were right. You were always the best, and thank you for being my friend.
disagree with that because I do think that like there was a legitimate apology. Like Brian legitimately apologizes to Roman for kind of abandoning him. Like, yes, at the end of the day, Roman does accept responsibility. It is not Brian's fault that he got busted. But Brian does feel legitimately bad that he walked out on his friend, right? And he
I don't.
apologizes for that in the same scene that
He
Roman,
feels
like,
he feels bad, but it's not like he could have like explicitly he couldn't have done anything. Right? Like he feels bad because he couldn't do anything for his friend, but there was nothing for him to do. Right? The point is that he lets Dom go in the first movie because he feels bad that he couldn't do anything for his friend. Even though there was like, but he couldn't do anything, not that he had the opportunity and chose not to do it. Right? Like this is just more of Brian's a saint, right? Like
that's interesting. I guess I see what you mean. But I feel like, like in an abstract sense, Brian could have done more for Roman, right? But he didn't. Just because, like, in the specific narrow avenue of could Brian have gotten, like gotten Roman off or whatever for whatever dumb shit Roman was doing, the answer is no. Like, I do think that he still does abandon his friend and move to LA, right? And that's the thing that he's apologizing for in that moment. And that's the thing where he later talks about why he gave Dom the keys and how it ties back to like the way that he did the way that he did Rome dirty a little, right?
I think that's a
Was
reach. I don't think the text of the movie supports this.
you know so I think the text of the movie does support it. I think your point is that the text of the movie is very inconsistent.
Okay.
Right? Like the text of the movie, Brian like apologizes and he says that exact thing, right? Where Rome goes, "Did you let that guy go in L.A.?" And Brian goes, "Yeah, basically."
Right.
Right?
But what the text of the movie says is that he like the line is something like I cop or not, I would have done anything to help you, right? But the text of the movie tells you that he couldn't have done anything, right? And that's when Rome counters with is that why you let that guy go in L.A., right? Um, and so I take your like I think the movie wants us to think that Brian feels bad, and the movie I think wants us to think that he has like a reason to feel bad, but like
But he never actually has that reason, right?
yeah.
There is no underlying reason at the end of
Yeah.
the day. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, I will take your point that the text. I think the text of the movie is consistent, but the tone of the movie wants to imply things that the text doesn't support. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm on board with that angle. I also think that at a certain point, you know, the the mechanics of superimposing his relationship with Dom to his relationship with Roman also doesn't work, right? Like obviously they are both friends and they are both like have this kind of like criminal relationship, but Brian does truly fuck Dom over and lie to his best friend. About like the Fast and Furious 1 is a movie where those things line up very well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Brian does legitimately fuck this guy over and he has a reason to feel bad about, like making that decision, right? I also think that even though I do think Too Fast Too Furious is better than Fast and Furious 1, a lot of that comes down to the action being better, and this stuff with like the plot and the stakes all working much better than everything that's going on in Fast and Furious 1. But the relationship between Vin Diesel and Paul Walker is a step above the relationship between Roman and actually, they're a little bit different. The thing I like about the relationship between Roman and Brian is that they're having so much fun. You know what I mean? Like these
Yeah.
guys, like the moment where they walk into Tej's, it's at night, they go to Tej's garage, and Roman says to Brian, there's a lot of potential here, and Brian does that thing where he hugs Roman from behind, like, yeah, brother. Like that is a moment that communicates kind of like true kind of casual friendship in a way that I don't think exists as much in the first movie
I agree.
with Brian and Dom. But like I think that the moment and the sunset when they are apologizing to one another doesn't carry the serious sort of vulnerable friendship, right? That you obviously can see that Dom and Brian share in
Yeah,
the
like
first film.
the last scene of the Fast and the Furious is like a big emotional moment that
Mhm.
largely works, right? I don't think there are a lot of big emotional moments in this movie that like that even like try and play the same way, right? Like the closest thing you get is the Sunset Apology, and that's not even trying to play in the same way that the first movie does. Which is, to its credit, it's not trying to do the same thing again,
Yeah.
right? But like,
That moment is understated, whereas the other one is climactic, right? The
yeah,
climax of the Fast and the Furious is this quarter mile drag race, which is full of this, you know, like these pregnant character beats that are playing out in the subtext while they are racing, right? Whereas in Too Fast Too Furious, all it is just the conversation that they are having is, and it is a quiet, it is a serene and a calm conversation, right? But there is like, again, outside of any bisexual subtext, there is really no extra subtext to that. Besides just the words on the page where Brian says he's sorry and Roman admits that he's blaming Brian for his own mistakes that he needs to kind of accept responsibility for. But yeah, but I do think that the playful side of it really does come into like part of what makes One Fast One Furious feel worse from the last time I watched it was that it is so serious and dour in a way that the later movies are not. And like the movies that make you fall in love with the Fast and Furious franchise, I think they're the things where Brian and Roman are like riffing. They're having like car to car banter, even though they can't actually talk to one another. They don't have the walkie talkies yet. As they're racing to go to the package in the Ferrari, and they're both showing off to one another, right? Like that's the kind of playfulness that communicates that like friendship that it's like they're just such bros. I I want to love like that, Mango.
uh, well, you know, I get that. I was gonna say like this almost feels like the Saturday morning cartoon version of the Fast and the Furious in some ways, right? And it feels and that I guess that's how like the rest of the series plays out, right? As like kind of the goofy or it's almost like the Saints Row effect, right? Where the first one is a serious movie and it just slowly like slides more into the absurd as the series goes on because that's the niche.
So I will say that it does get crazier, but I don't think it ever gets absurd. Like the thing that makes the Fast and the Furious work is that it is incredibly out there, high octane shit, but also it's taking itself dead seriously.
Yeah, so
Like,
so I mean, it does get more absurd, right? But
yeah,
like, it's not that like it's the absurdity isn't played for laughs like it is to say Saints Row, right? Like that's just to like point out where that comparison doesn't work, right? Because like fucking throwing a torpedo across the ice, as you've described, happens in one of these later movies. That's absurd, but it's played seriously. Whereas if you did
yeah.
that in like say Saints Row, it would be like played for a gag, right?
Yeah, and part of the tension I think in the Fast and the Furious franchise, that sort of rocks it a little bit in the later installments, is that The Rock. This is something. Did we talk about the Black Adam trailer last week? We did,
Yes,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the thing that really attracted me to the Black Adam trailer is that The Rock is not playing The Rock in it, right? That he seems to truly be playing, you know, Teth Adam, Black Adam, this fucking serious guy who is from ancient Egypt and is going to murder and is a supervillain, right? but he just so happens to be one that will murder people, right? Or that will save lives. I mean to say, rather, he's an anti-hero, I guess is a better word for what Black Adam is, and how that's so different compared to what we get from The Rock normally, right? In Jumanji, in Jungle Cruise, in Hobbs and Shaw, which is a Fast and Furious spinoff. All of those movies are movies where he has this very like winking, charismatic, you know, persona, and
He's
that's
basically playing
something.
his wrestling character, kind of.
Yeah, and that's something that comes out in the Fast and Furious series, right, over time. But in Fast Five, we talked about this. In Fast Five, he is dead. He's playing dead straight because that movie star persona hasn't shown up yet. But by the time we get to Fast 7 and Fast 8, um it is a little bit less serious, and he is kind of treating it like a Saturday morning cartoon, which kind of is why things don't really work and don't really coalesce in some of those movies. um but obviously, that's a preview of later opinions. We'll get there. Where and the thing that's the opposite of this is Vin Diesel, who is, in the words of Patrick H. Willems, every word that Vin Diesel speaks in the Fast and Furious series, it's like goddamn Shakespeare. You know what I mean? Like, he is playing it to the utmost sincerity as they are talking about the most batshit insane shit, right? And I think that's the stuff that is like the heart of what makes these movies great. So do you think One Fast One Furious is better than Too Fast Too Furious? Would you
Yes,
say that? Okay,
I would, without any reservation.
sure, yeah, okay. Uh, well, I guess that's our rankings. We have our Marvel rankings, but I do want to keep track of our Fast and Furious rankings.
Oh, that's a good
So
point. Gotta spin up a another Google Doc.
so we have Too Furious, Too Fast, and The Fast and the Furious. I'm very interested to see where Tokyo Drift ends up on your on your outline.
Oof. I'm excited to see Tokyo Drift just because there's the whole Donkey Kong thing. DK.
Tokyo Drift is the one that gets memed on the most. But God, it's a whole thing. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, no, I would be interested to. I'm interested to see kind of how this looks since I haven't really seen any of these movies. But like, I know it's like around like the fourth or the fifth one where like it actually coalesces into like a cinematic universe, as it were, right? Like the first three are kind of like largely standalone, right? Like you don't need to have watched the first one to understand what's happening in Too Fast, Too Furious. And it's just Paul Walker's character, right? Like none of the other characters come over, except for
Technically, the
the
FBI
FBI
guy,
agent. Yeah,
but first of all, he does not ever come back after this movie.
really, that's a
Yeah,
disappointment.
in a movie with tons and tons of continuity. Well, like at a certain point, they're above the FBI's. Oh, actually, I could be wrong about that.
Anyway, we'll
We'll
figure.
we'll see.
Yeah,
Fast and Furious, the fourth one, is the one I have seen. I think I've only seen it once or twice, and he might come back in that one. I don't quite remember.
I was like, if you want to bring the character back, you just promote him along with the crew, right? Like now he's like the director of like the car force or whatever they're doing. Um,
God, hell yeah, that's beautiful. What a thing of beauty. But yes, the first three are definitely very standalone. I mean, the third one has literally no other characters from the franchise except for at the very end Vin Diesel shows up. And it is like Vin Diesel shows up in the way that, like Nick Fury shows up at the end of Iron Man, basically. So
and he's not even in the second movie. Wait, so like the plot of Tokyo Drift is completely divorced from anything that's come so far.
yes, but it loops back around. So the big thing outside of the context of the movie itself to know is that Tokyo Drift is when the most important man, maybe the second most important man, because I think they're all written by the same guy, starting with three. Um, the most important guy that comes in Tokyo Drift is director Justin Lin, right? Justin Lin came from, he made like an indie movie, and his first like big blockbusters is essentially Tokyo Drift, and then he stays on to direct Fast and Furious, Fast Five, whatever Fast and Furious 6 is called, and then he comes back later and is the guy that did F9. And in fact, he was supposed to do F10 and probably got fired, and we're all very nervous about that, by the way. So like he came in and is the one who sort of ushered the whole franchise into the state at which it became kind of famous, right? Which is that sort of, Fast 5, Fast 6, Fast 7 run, of when like kind of the group coalesces and everything. So it starts off like you are going to watch this movie and it is going to have zero connection to anything else, right? Um wasn't it just Furious 6? I think it might be Furious 6.
So,
I think it was Fast 5 and Furious 6.
according to Wikipedia, it says it is Fast and Furious 6, which makes it the only one that like follows a conventional sequeling title or format, except that it follows Fast and Furious in like the typography. It's like the Fast and the Furious, and it's Too Fast, Too Furious, which is not conventional. Then it's the Fast and the Furious : Tokyo Drift, no number. Fast and Furious for 4, Fast 5, and then Fast and Furious 6, which typographically only follows Fast and Furious, which is the fourth one.
Right. Yeah, and then it's Furious 7, and then it is F8, The Fate of the Furious, and then it's F9.
According to Wikipedia, is The Fate of the Furious, and then F9, and then Fast X.
Yeah, baby. Fast X for Fast 10. God, this movie franchise. Even the titles are so great. Yeah, so Justin Lin enters in Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, and he introduces new stuff to kind of the lore and the continuity. And then that stuff will come back later, right? So the next time we do this, you will watch that movie and you will see zero connections. But as we watch Fast and Furious, Fast 5, Fast and Furious 6, they will tie back together, and wrap things around, basically.
So like, yes, Tokyo Drift is the beginning of the Avengers Initiative equivalent, essentially, is what it sounds like.
Technically speaking, it would really be the first one that is sort of like that. I mean, the overarching progression is that you have 1, 2, and 3, which are all each standalone stories, essentially, right? Brian O'Connor features in the first two, but nobody features in the third one. Then you find out that a character in Tokyo Drift used to roll in Vin Diesel's crew, right? Vin Diesel shows up and he's looking for his friend, right? Then there's Fast and Furious, which is the fourth one, and in Fast and Furious, you see Vin Diesel hanging out with that guy from his crew, right? Like, so you now know that Fast and Furious is a flashback prequel to what would eventually be Tokyo Drift, right?
Wait,
Um,
Fast and Furious is a prequel?
yeah, Fast and Furious is a sequel to The Fast and the Furious and Too Fast Too Furious, but it is chronologically before Tokyo Drift. This will make sense later. But it is not going to make a lot of sense later. Okay.
Is this the only timeline shakeup that I have to worry about?
Basically yes. Okay, and then what happens? So it's 4, right? And then it is 5 and 6, and then it is Tokyo Drift, right? So after 6, Tokyo Drift happens. Then 7, 8, 9. That's it.
What?
Yeah,
What?
so this will make very little sense, but I just want you to keep in mind, pay attention to all the little signifiers that Tokyo Drift is like a movie from 2005, and just remember those. Just remember those because they pay zero attention to that detail. It is not as though like Fast and Furious and Fast 5 and Fast and Furious 6 are period pieces set before 2005. They're all essentially set in the present day, but then we are told that Tokyo Drift, where everyone has flip phones, is like is actually the future. This will make so much more sense. I hope it is baffling right now, though. I hope it's fucking baffling.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, anyway, and then 4 is when the big thing that 4 does is it reunites Brian and Dom, right?
Okay.
Fast and Furious is about the two of them coming back together. Fast 5 is the Avengers, which is pulling in characters from all over, right? So you get Roman and Tej show back up. Um, you get characters from 4, 3, you get a bunch of different characters all kind of rejoining the narrative, which is where like the family stuff really kicks in.
Makes sense.
I honestly, man, I wish I could go back. I wish I could like X-Men like blink thing you, because it is such a fucking
That's
crazy
Men in
moment.
Black, not
Oh
X-Men.
yeah, what is it? Yeah, right. Men in Black. Yeah. Because it is such like a crazy moment when all of these characters show up like one after another, right? Like,
Okay. I believe you, right? Like, we're putting together a crew and it's like calls in all, all your friendly faces. I'm sure. I get
yep.
that's like the moment, right? It's like what the Expendables does but doesn't do any work for. Um uh
Honestly, the funniest thing about it is that it predates the event. Like I keep calling it the Avengers of the Fast and Furious franchise, but Fast 5 came out in 2011, which is a year before the Avengers came out. So actually, the Avengers is like the Fast 5 of the Marvel
yeah,
universe.
except we knew the Avengers was coming, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's true. That's true.
right?
Yeah.
Because I remember Fast Five was kind of like when it's like when someone I remember seeing the post being like, "Holy shit!" Like this actually all makes sense now, right? Like, or at least to some level, right? Like,
Yep.
um, so yeah, um, I don't know. You got anything else to say about Too Fast, Too
No,
Furious?
no. I obviously love every single one of these videos, and I could talk about them for hours for no reason, but I think we're done. We can move on with our lives.
All right. How was your week?
Hmm. Well, the big thing that happened in my week is that I hit legend in Hearthstone for the very first time,
Yay!
which I'm very proud of with that Quest Hunter deck. Actually, let me pull up some statistics. Let's take a look at these statistics because I haven't actually looked at them, but I think it'll be kind of neat to sort of break it down. So, I played a total of 66 plus 55, that's 111 plus 5, 116 games. It took me 116 games to get from it looks like it must have been um it must have been plat 10 all the way to legend, right? Which is going all the way through platinum and then all the way through diamond and then all the way up into legend. Over the course of that, my win rate seems to have been I had 60%. Uh the win rate was in the high 60s, in the high 60%. What's the average of 72 plus it would be 66%. It was a 60% win rate on the fourth version of the deck and a 72% win rate on the first version of the deck, and the other two were so minor that they probably don't count. So yeah, so I guess I that must be a really good win rate at that point, I guess. Getting a 66% win rate to kind of carry you to legend. Basically, to explain how some of this works for the uninitiated when it comes to Hearthstone. Hearthstone has a star system, right? And basically it says every time you win, you gain a star, and every time you lose a star, right? But there are floors and there are bonuses, which is how people can kind of you can climb at a 50% win rate with stars and with the floors. So basically, if you lose a game at plat 5 or plat 10 or diamond 5, diamond 10, right? Like you can't sync once you've achieved that milestone, right? So if you lose games there, you are not penalized for losing those games. They don't count against your win rate, essentially. And then when you win 3 games in a row, the third game and every game thereafter will give you bonus stars, right? So winning 3 games in a row, let's just say all else being equal, gives you 4 stars when winning 3 games every other one would give you 3 stars, kind of like net, right? But the thing that I didn't quite realize is that actually uh 3-star, or that bonus, that the bonus stars goes away in the bottom ranks of diamond, right? So from diamond 5 to legend, you never get bonus stars. You legitimately have to get, like 1 star for every win all the way up, through up and until you hit legend. um and I guess that's interesting. I like it's kind of crazy that this was such a run that I was able to go on in terms of just like climbing and climbing. It looks like I started, yeah, it was legitimately okay. Actually, the first time I ran this Quest Hunter deck was in gold 6. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sort of leagues of climbing all the way to the top. Um and the ability to just kind of rocket past some of these ranks is all because of that sort of like win rate bonus, right? So getting out of plat took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 15 games, it looks like. Wow, yeah, holy shit. It took 15 games to get all the way out of plat, but it would have taken me more than 50 games to get from diamond 5 to legend. So I don't know. I don't know if any of this is fucking interesting. The real thing that was crazy to me about it was I had half the month left, so I was just like, I'm gonna log on and start rolling some hunter games and see what happens with this like questline hunter deck. And I just happened to win the last 4 in a row. Some of which were like very like real wins. I got a guy to concede because I played an ice trap. Ice trap is a hunter trap. It just says when your opponent casts a spell, it bounces it back to their hand, kind of like freezing trap. Um, Ice trap is insanely good in that deck because one of the big uh, archetypes. There's 2 types that you can really punish with ice trap. Number 1 is big spell mage. So it is a mage deck that revolves around casting 9 or 10 mana spells, and that's it. So laying an ice trap against that deck is incredibly painful because normally what you want to do is you just toss out a really shitty spell, right? And you just let it sit in your hand and you don't worry about it. But against those big mage decks, you play an ice trap, they try and cast their 10 mana spell, it's gone. They can't do anything with that. Like they can't get to 11 mana. It just sits in their hand for the rest of the fucking game because there's nothing that they to ever cast it. Plus, they basically did 10 mana do nothing on their turn, right? Because they cast into an ice trap. And the other version of this is Druid, which is casting a lot of 8 mana spells. They have 2 spells. One is called, I think it's called Miracle Growth, and the other one is called Celestial Alignment, which are 2 really powerful spells. And one of those games I just won because I ice trapped his Celestial Alignment. He tried to cast Celestial Alignment on 8 and fucked it up, and he auto conceded. And it's just like, I'm sorry, buddy, right? Like that's life. Basically, it's like casting a 2 mana extra turn spell, right? Like because he just sat there and did absolutely nothing. But in the very final game, I thought should have lost. Right? He legitimately outplayed me. He played around the ice traps. I was playing against Big Spell Mage, which is a favorable matchup. And he kind of forced me into this corner, which you never want to get into with Quest Hunter, where one of the things you're looking to do with that deck is you reset your hero power to 0, and then the end result of the quest is every time you cast a spell, you refresh your hero power.
Right.
So as a hunter, you're casting all these low mana cost spells, and you're pinging face over and over again, just like pow, 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 pow. With the mage, the thing that he did was I blew everything to get him to 3 health, and then I had an explosive trap on my side of the field, right? Um, and he knew that if he attacked into my explosive traps, he died, right? But he had 1 card that was able to give him 5 health back. He played the hero card, which also gave him, 2 huge minions or whatever. And he set me up for lethal in the following turn. And there were maybe like 3 or 4 cards in my deck at that point that I could have top decked in order to get lethal, and I just sort of happened to draw it. But it's just like, I guess you play to your outs. Anyway, now that I'm legend, what reason is there to fucking play Hearthstone again? I guess I don't know.
Yep. Them's the breaks, right? Like, what are you gonna What are you gonna do? So, what did you change about your deck to make it to the legendary run?
Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so the first version of the Questline Hunter. So I played four versions um over the course of it, where I was basically just kind of looking at what's the stuff that, you know, whenever I'm playing a deck for a really long time, there's always that feeling of what's the stuff I want to pull out, what's not pulling its weight, right? The first version of the deck was a little bit slower and included a package that I called the package. Bronzebeard is a 3 mana 2/4 that says your battle cries trigger twice. Um, and there was this package that I was using, which was Bronzebeard, and School Teacher. So School Teacher is a 4 mana 4/3 that says, um, Battle Cry, you add a 1/1 Naga to your hand and you teach it, quote unquote, a spell to cast when it comes into play, right? Which is an efficient, it's a small efficiency thing because the Nagaling is a 1 mana 1/1. So you play School Teacher, you give it a 3 mana card, and that card can trigger your quest, right? So if I get an aimed shot, for instance, which just, deals 3 damage to face or whatever, and I play my Noggling, that will advance the quest. So it's kind of like having extra spells in your deck, right? But the big thing that was really powerful for School Teacher is that when you Bran and School Teacher together, which is a 9 mana combo, you get two Nogglings, and then you play both Nogglings, and you get those spells to cast twice, which is like insane value, right? Whole decks have been built around that control interaction of being able to get. I mean, it's or it's 4 3 mana spells, so up to 12 mana, of stats, plus you have all these bodies on the board and like threats that they need to deal with and stuff like that. um but the thing about it that was bad was I'm playing a Renathal deck, right? Renathal ups my starting health to 40, which is actually really useful and important for Quest Hunter, because one of the decisions you need to make as Quest Hunter is I'm abandoning the board and I'm going face, right? I am in my kill zone here. Whatever it is, I've activated my quest. I'm sort of done with this portion of, you know this portion of the deck of fighting for the board. I don't have very many minions in this deck. I'm just going to send everything to face, and I need to be able to weather 20 damage coming in because I'm just not clearing any of the opponent's boards, right? Um, and I was realizing that because I'm playing that 40 card deck, that bigger Renathal deck, that finding both Bran and School Teacher was really painful, and I didn't have a lot of other battle cry synergies to,
You have value out of.
combine with it. Yeah, like there was the hero card that has some battle cry synergies because the hero battle cries in some secrets. There is one card that draws cards. So I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a 40 card deck. There's 5 cards. Yeah, not bad. You know, what is that? uh, a little bit 12% of the deck, right? Like 13.33% of the deck is battle cries or whatever that can, um
One
actually it's a little
eighth.
bit more. There's two more than that too. So there's a certain amount of the deck that has this sort of like battle cry synergy, but just like finding Bran was so hard that it just didn't feel worth it. And I wanted the deck to be leaner and I wanted it to be faster. Especially because Bran encourages you to be playing minions when the deck wants you to be playing spells to reset your hero power. So the first variation that I made, which wasn't what I wanted, it added a card called Dragonbane Shot, which is a repeatable spell. As long as you're doing 2 damage to something, it pops back into his hand, basically. Um, it's 2 damage, honorable kill, put a Dragonbane Shot into your hand. So if you're just killing 2 damage stuff, you can complete your quest without spending any cards, which is pretty valuable, right? But it is a 3 mana deal 2 damage card, which is very inefficient, and
Right.
you just want to be faster than that. And also it was running some other tech cards that I just felt like weren't pulling their weight. There's called Urchin Spines, which gives your spells poisonous, which is like that's useful for clearing the board, but like I'm just good enough to know when I need to not worry about that kind of thing. So I pretty quickly got rid of that version of the deck. And I picked up a different version that was specifically running um, a bigger spell secret package, right? So it was just finding There two spells which are called Furious Howl, which is a 2 mana spell, and it is draw a card until you have 3 cards in hand. So if you have 1 card in hand, it's 2 mana draw 2. If you have no cards, it's 2 mana draw 3, right? Which is a really powerful refill tool. And then just a lot of like low cost shit, right? So that you could dump your hand at Furious Howl to get it all back, that kind of a thing. Also, I realized that there is another card in this deck called Barak Kodobane that I was not using. He's a 5 mana 3/5 that he's a 5 mana 3/5 that draws you a 1, 2, and 3 cost spell. And Barak Kodobane does not seem powerful, but he was probably the best card in the deck on the whole, in the sense that I feel like every game I cast Barack Kodobane, I won, just because the refill is insane, and getting a 3/5 body is actually pretty useful too for a variety of different reasons. Um, so yeah, so that was the big thing uh, that I changed in order to like really own, I don't know, in order to really own that piece of the puzzle.
Nice, nice. And you rode it all the way to victory, so that's some good stuff too.
Yeah.
On my end, I have a couple things from the past couple weeks that I forgot to dig into. There was another Rumble versus Beta, which was really good, a lot of fun. They have increased some of the complexity on the base move set, and they also announced it's like coming out, I think, like August 11th. So,
Oh,
um, look forward to that. It is a ton of fun. I have rarely had this much fun with a game before. What else? While I was a couple weeks ago visiting with some friends, I played Boomerang Fu, which is a fun little indie game. Essentially, it's like a small multiplayer game. You play as basically a cute little thing with a boomerang, and it's like a one hit kill. And the idea is to be the last man standing. Then as you keep playing, power ups drop. Um, I give you a variety of like unique little powers. It's a lot of fun for a very quick game. It was like this is what we played when we were like we don't feel like try harding on Smash. We're gonna play some like this dumb little boomerang game. So we played Boomerang Fu, which was a lot of fun. Um, Otherwise, for most of last week, I was in Las Vegas, um, where I discovered that I hated Las Vegas once again. Every couple of years, I'm like, oh, I'll go to Vegas. That's a cool place. And then I realize I hate it, just because like everything is it's on the strip. Everything is so expensive, and like not worth like I went to some nice restaurants, and I would say that the money was worth it there, but like the $15 hamburger in like the lobby of the hotel is not worth it. And it just was painful every time. And it's also like 110 degrees outside, except for the one day it rained briefly when it was 90. What a relief, right? It is not. I don't know. It's not my favorite place to go. Um, and the only gaming kind of relevant thing there is that I don't understand how video poker, or I don't understand why people like video poker. We were talking a little bit about this before the show started, but like, there's like no control, right? Like, what you control is the number of lines you bet, and then you hit a button, and then it tells you most of the time that you've lost your money, and then you hit the button again, and then you watch your money go away, and then you walk away from the machine because like it's like even if it was just like something like Yahtzee, right? Like Yahtzee gives you a little bit of control, right? Like or I don't like I typically don't play table games, but when I have in the past, those have been fun because you at least have like some control. Like you can control your odds, right? Like famously, the best game you have the best odds at is blackjack. That's a little bit too algorithmic for me to like get a lot of enjoyment out of because you just kind of like play the odds. But like something like roulette, right? Like, even though it is completely fucking random, you've got choices to make and you can put stuff down, and like sometimes you win. Um, and it seems to me at least that like the table games are designed to churn you a little bit more, right? Like they give you a little bit so you keep playing and you can draw out the experience for a while. I have never played, but I have heard from friends that enjoy it that Pai Gow is very good for like being a very slow playing game where you don't drain your money very quickly. But slots seems like the opposite of that. It's just like you hit the button and you watch the lights light up, and if you're lucky, you get like some big lights and you get some money back. But most of the time, you don't. Um, and so I didn't even get any enjoyment out of that. So
Yeah, this is one of those things that I worked or not that I worked, that I like read up on, which we talked about, right? Like the real thing that gambling addicts are doing is they are paying gambling services for access to a thing that they want, right? Like they don't view it as
right,
a money making scheme, they view it as a service that they are purchasing, and they just the price of the thing happens to fluctuate. And the thing that they are looking for is that machine zone where they can just kind of get rid of their anxieties, and just kind of disappear into the game, which I think all of us would argue is something that you can do in like World of Warcraft way easier and way cheaper, but whatever. Um,
Yeah, I mean, but that
um,
that was part of the thing, right? Like maybe I was like playing like the wrong amount. Like I was, I would be like, oh, I go sit down at like a relatively inexpensive slot and like play max lines because that gives you the most odds of winning. But I like burned through $20 in like 5 to 10 minutes. It's like that's not sustainable for any amount of time if I don't want to like spend $1,000, which I didn't. Um, and so like maybe there were cheaper slot machines. I just wasn't doing my homework to like find the right slot machine. But like you said, right, you're paying for flow state essentially. Um,
yeah, and the and I this is maybe where I risk a controversial opinion because this stuff bugs me, which is why I ended up doing this research in the first place, right? To sort of see, because people will talk about it. Diablo Immortal actually might be a really good example of this. Thinking about it, where the way people have talked about Diablo Immortal and Diablo Immortal's kind of monetization scheme, a lot of the time people will bring up that sort of gambling idea, right? That the idea is the game is taking advantage of people who are susceptible to gambling, or they are gambling addicts, or something else sort of along those lines. um this, I think, is misguided and untrue. In fact, it is fundamentally untrue basically everywhere in gaming for as far as I can see, right? Realistically speaking, I do think people are addicted, but I just think that they're addicted to they are not addicted to gambling because they do not look like gambling addicts, right? So the exact, like, loot boxes are a good example of this. People talk about how, oh, well, like loot boxes are this predatory force. They are gambling and they are attacking gambling addicts, right? But the thing about a gambling addict is that a gambling addict is using the process of gambling to achieve the flow state, right? To get into the machine zone, right? Whereas I think the power of loot boxes are that they have high quality items that people find desirable, and it just obfuscates the process of getting the desirable item behind a variable number of loot boxes, right? So for instance, if there is a new Overwatch skin that you want, if you want the lifeguard Pharah skin or whatever, right, you need to purchase a certain number of loot boxes until you roll either enough coins that you can buy it, or you roll the skin itself, right? um
you can't just go
but
buy it for like $10.
Yeah, exactly. But that process does not resemble the process of a gambling addict at all. Because the point of a gambling addict isn't that they roll loot boxes because they want something, or in this instance, they would be, playing video poker. They do not play the video poker because they want to make money. Gambling addicts understand that it is a losing proposition to play these games, right? What they want is access to the flow state. And I do not think that there is a person out there who goes and opens loot box video, or like opens loot boxes over and over and over again because opening loot boxes gives them access to the flow state. Like, I just think that that's like a fundamentally untrue proposition, right? Really, what these people are addicted to is gaming, right? They are gaming addicts who are addicted to the games that they are playing, and therefore they are sinking the money into the game, that the game, essentially says, this is the price you have to pay to get this thing, in order to achieve that, like, in order to achieve that goal of whatever it is, completing or owning the thing in the game that they want. But the thing that the addictive piece there is the game. It is not actually the monetization. The monetization is taking advantage of one's addiction to Overwatch. It is not that it is inducing someone to be addicted to gambling on Overwatch, if that makes sense. And I understand that that is an insanely, weird, like, needle to thread, in like the whole conversation, since I don't actually think loot boxes are good, obviously. I think they're a pretty poor way to monetize most games. But it really bothers me when people use this language of, oh, like, these things are inducing gambling addiction in people. They are taking advantage of people's addictive tendencies towards gambling, when no, that is a reflection of a misunderstanding of how gambling addicts work, right? And yeah, that's just like a pet peeve thing that,
Yeah,
that bothers me, I guess.
so that's super interesting, and I totally get that. I wonder, kind like, because like I think this is also a thing that happens where people kind of like confuse consensual, less than ideal behavior with ruinous addiction, right? Like a lot of people you were talking about, I presume, because casinos are very successful businesses, do kind of like pay for flow state thing and don't lose all of their money, right? Like they don't like end up like on the street. They just
Yep.
spend their money in a way that we might view as like less less advantageous. And part of that too is like it's not necessarily for nothing, right? Like you get free drinks while you're gambling, right? And like if you do it enough, you will be comped rooms, right? Like they will want you to come back and spend more of your money on the gambling state. So it's not like it's you know I mean, that, like, again, it doesn't make it good. This is like the difference between, like, assuming that anybody who, this is like a drinking thing, right? Like, like, yes, it is probably not good to go get, like, plastered, you know, to get plastered in any case, right? But if you do it once in a while, it's not the end of the world. It's only if you're doing it every day and you're spending all of your money on booze and you're, like, living at the bottom of the bottle, you can't hold down a job that it becomes ruinous, right?
Yeah. No, I
Um,
mean that's what a high functioning alcoholic is,
yeah,
right? Someone who is able to keep a job and have normal relationships, but they are also, an addict to alcohol. Um and I think that kind of person also exists for
yeah.
other forms of addiction.
And I think so. This is the interesting thing with loot box and like gambling ish stuff. Is part of the thing here is because it's all individualized, you can feed in the high early, right? Like I feel like if the first time I sat down at a slot machine and I put $20 in, my first thing was a win. It was a moderate win, like you won $10 back, right? I'm like, oh, this is great, and I had chased that maybe a little bit further than the $20. But because it's like an arbitrary machine, and because they're highly regulated machines, right? They can't do that. They can't like they could the technology probably exists. They could camera in on you and like set the machine to like win, but obviously that means it's not a game of chance and it like breaks all sorts of regulations around the machines, right? Um, but there's nothing like that around video game boxes, and so like as a feature they will say like your first pack is guaranteed to like pop off, right? Like, and there is bad luck protection, so at some point you will get the dubers, right? Like that's part of the reason why like I like I said, I fell off slot machines, right? Like in my $20 I got like a win for like 15 cents once, right? And it's like fuck you, right? Like there's and if they had some sort of bad luck protection, I might have stayed around longer, right? Again, none of this is talking about the ethicality of any of this because it's all bad, but like it's targeting a different thing. Um, and I think to your point too, right? Like loot boxes, I feel like there are less people. Like the stories you hear about people being ruinous with loot boxes is there are a couple, but a lot of them seem to be like less ruinous and more like people who have too much money that spend it, or like kids who don't really understand what they're doing, spending a lot of money, right? Like they're granted there are definitely some people who will spend themselves out of house and home on loot boxes, but I feel like that is a less common story than people who like gamble themselves out of house and home. And so I think I agree with you that it's like basically targeting a different kind of behavior.
Yeah, you know. I just I think this stuff is kind of complicated, especially because like addiction itself is like
Yeah,
a pretty complicated thing. Like one of the prerequisites to define an addiction is you have to be able to um you have to be able to demonstrate that ruination, right? So for instance, I tell this story all the time when I was well, maybe I shouldn't tell this story. Whatever. When I was an RA in college, we knew of a resident who was using heroin. Uh, like the hardest drug that there is because she was a stripper on like the side or whatever. And her stripper friends got her into heroin. But like her grades were fine. She was still active on campus, right? Like, and she just needed to. Yeah, she just used heroin in order to keep herself kind of calm and get through the stress of like working at like a high end university, right? Like in these really competitive programs. Um, and that's a tough thing. How do you reconcile that, right? Like we all understand that heroin is awful and will like cause people to you know turn into junkies or whatever else, right? But like, what
Well,
is the
so that
relationship between?
that's the thing. So this is very interesting because I have heard this. There is a professor at a university. I forget. He's a professor at Columbia University. His name is Carl Hart. He like one of his big things is like he now openly does heroin. He has done it for a while, but he is like, I am responsible about it, right? Like I didn't do it when I was raising my kids because I needed to raise my kids. My kids are in college now, and so my wife and I occasionally do a little bit of heroin for fun, and we're responsible about it, and that's fine. Obviously, comes from a kind of like a drug decriminalization kind of angle, right? It's like most adults can handle this with their lives, right? Like,
Yep.
and it could turn you into a junkie, right? And there should be support, like, there's talks about like, how we deal with like what's the appropriate response, what's the appropriate legalization, decriminalization regime to deal with like, the most vulnerable people that potentially go for a ride on this stuff. But like to your point, there's not like if you are actually have your shit together, right? Like it's just a vice, right? Like there's not necessarily anything wrong with it. And I think something that you're talking about, kind of is like there's this like conflation of addiction and dependence, right?
Mm.
Like because like dependence is like the chemical physiological need, right? Like I probably at this point have a dependence on caffeine, right? Because I drink enough of it, right? Am I addicted to it? To your, like part of the definition of addiction is harm. It's like I'm not going and fucking like knocking over, the local Wawa to like steal like a tub of coffee, right? Like, and so I don't think anybody would say I was addicted. And in the same way, right? Like video games, you cannot be chemically dependent on them. At least not in like the sense that that dependence means, right? Like you can only be addicted to them in the sense that you ignore your duties, or you ignore your
Well, so you can become chemically addicted in the sense that it is the thing that you rely on in order to kind of induce your brain. This is the
right,
same thing as the machine zone, right? Like you
right, but
induce the desirable state of your brain, but it is not an external chemical
call
that you are
addiction, right,
applying to yourself.
right.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is
yeah.
not dependence, is what I mean, right,
One could addict themselves to anything by that standard, right?
right,
Like as
yes.
long as you can find a way to make model trains give you the good brain juice, right? Like you can become addicted to model trains.
Yeah, I mean, and you know what? I'm sure that like they would never describe it this way, but there are stories of like dudes who like spend fortunes on like recreating like tiny villages in their basements to their
Yep.
wives' chagrin, right? Like
Yeah,
um,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's funny because like another statistic that I think is fucked up and tough to hear is that more people quit drugs than uh become addicted to them, right? Which is this idea that I mean, this is one of those things that I think is kind of weirdly misleading, but it's one of those statistics that bounces off of you because there's this idea that like anyone who ever does heroin will become a junkie, right? But the reality is that most people quit before that happens, right? Like only a smaller than 50%, you know, subset will actually follow that addiction all the way into, what we would describe to be a state of like they are a junkie to the like the chemical, right? Um, and I'm pretty sure that this statistic is misleading because it includes people who do it once and
once,
never
yeah.
ever do it again. You know what I mean? Like if you were to sort of look at it and measure against the use case, I'm pretty sure it would ramp up pretty quickly. It's kind of like how most people who smoke don't get lung cancer, but most people who get lung cancer are smokers, right? Where there's a clear causal link between the two. It is just like not quite as one to one as you would think.
This is
And like,
true of a lot of things, right? Like most
yeah,
people who are homeless for a day or two, right? And
yeah, yeah,
but the issue is with the chronically homeless or the chronic users or or the chronic smoker, right? Like or the chronic gambler, right? Or the chronic gamer. God damn it, we are peddlers
yeah.
of
I mean,
sin
I
on this
think I
podcast.
probably qualify for some level of like I'm probably a high functioning gaming addict by most metrics, right? In the sense that like the amount of time I put into video games must be absolutely fucking insane by like most people's standards, I'm sure. If I were to go to some like psychologist's office and they were to ask how many hours do you put into video games, I'm sure it would be the biggest category, right? Like, but like also at the end of the day, that's just because it's
Yeah,
like the conduit for a social life, right?
yeah. I mean,
In the status of quarantine and everything else.
not only that, but there's also like where does like choice diverge from like ruination, right? Like like there is potentially an argument, right? Like that, like someone who chooses to drink themselves to death, maybe that's just what they want to do, right? Like and like like obviously, I don't think that's great, but like their choice at some level, right? But like to your point, right? Like I don't know, like I don't think either of us would be considered addicts because like if your house was burning down, you would leave the house, you wouldn't finish the raid, right? Like if you if your gaming was interfering with your ability to do your job, you would probably game less or find another job that would accommodate your gaming, right? Which and that's like
Yeah.
kind of like at that level of like, well, is it detrimental, right? Like you took a lower, like theoretically you took a part-time job so you could game more. Is that like at the level where it's detrimental, or is that just kind of like you making a choice to live the life the way you want to, right? And that addiction, I think, only comes when it's like it feels like you are no longer in control, like you are no longer capable of making the choice. I guess I don't know.
Yeah.
Part of this, whoever's listening, neither of us are doctors, neither of us are psychiatrists. If you were
True.
going,
That's
if
definitely
if you
true.
were thinking like, should I do heroin, and you heard me say like some people could use heroin responsibly, don't listen to me, right? Like,
Jesus
please
Christ.
do not go do
You know what's
heroin.
funny? One of the things that I think is maybe the most foundational pieces of writing I've ever read in my life, which is funny because I ended up taking a class from this guy. Um, but he wrote a God, the fuck was his name is Matthew Clam, and in 2001 he wrote an article called "Experiencing Ecstasy," right, for the New York Times Magazine, which was a really long, kind of drawn out article explaining how his use of ecstasy at Dartmouth in the 80s was very different than the modern use of ecstasy as a party drug in New York City in the early 2000s, right? This was in 2001 that he wrote this article, and I read that article when I was a kid, because that was the thing I used to do. I used to
Yeah.
read articles in the New York Times Magazine, though I was very young to be reading that at the time. I realized I would have been 11, but anyway, I remember reading that article and thinking a lot about it, and eventually he came and he was like an adjunct professor at Hopkins, and I took a class from him, which was really cool and everything. But in the article about ecstasy, the thing that he talks about was no one had access to it, right? So they had sort of forced moderation, which was every once in a while, somebody would take a trip down to New York and they would buy a bunch of it for everyone, right? Like they would they would become like a drug smuggler at that point, right? They would buy like a ton of it and then cart it back, and everyone would get a couple, like you would get a couple of the pills that you got, and they would do it, you know, 5 hits over the course of a month or something like that, right? Before there was ever the chance for somebody to go and get more of it, right? Um, and how that had the effect of, physiologically speaking, making it so that the drug was like much better and much more enjoyable, right? And the article eventually goes into the physiology of people who go out and are using ecstasy every single weekend at clubs and raves and stuff in the New York City nightlife, are sort of inducing like really like crazy depression and anxiety problems in themselves, because the thing when you take a lot of a drug that interacts with your brain physiology is you are training your brain to no longer naturally generate those chemicals. It is just waiting for you to take the pill. This happens with sleeping pills, actually. This is why people who are on sleeping pills sometimes get worse insomnia, because they train themselves to not be able to sleep without a pill. um, anyway, and it's just like that stuff I find to be incredibly fucking fascinating. And also, I don't do drugs, so don't listen to anything I have to say.
Yeah. No, Lou says in the chat, what are we talking about? I was out buying heroin because Mango told me to. You know
Just
what,
walking
Lou?
down the street,
Lou,
get a little heroin.
Lou, of all the people I know, I am sure you are in the top 10 of people I think who could responsibly use heroin. So go for it. Um, uh, uh, So what else was I gonna say? I have mentioned on this podcast that I have occasionally partaken in psychedelics, and I can feel that, right? There is like good science around, like, if you do it every weekend, you will quickly build up a tolerance, and you will not be able um, to do it, or you will not be able to like experience the same effects. There's just a bunch of stuff like that, right? Um, but yeah, again, that's that's it's I don't know. It's a weird world. Um, yeah. It's interesting just because there are like legitimate therapeutic uses for some of this stuff, right? Without even going into like the easy test case for this, which is uh you know um opioids, right? Like opioids are like real medicine that sometimes gets abused. Although the statistics around that are actually like, this is what, like, we were talking about, like misleading drug statistics. One of the interesting things is that like most prescription opioid abuse isn't by, like, it's not like most people who take opioids for pain relief become addicts. It's that most prescription opioid abuse is people taking it from their friends and family who have extra prescription, right? Um, it's but we are way outside of the kin of our podcast.
We talk about games on this podcast. This podcast is about games, you guys.
Yeah,
Yep, definitely games.
yeah. This podcast is now some derps talk about Fast and Furious and heroin, I guess. Um, yeah. All right. Well, I guess that's our show. Anything you want to talk about, buddy?
I have nothing else that I want to talk about. The Immortal Empires map is a thing of
Right.
beauty, and I've cried about it. It is done. Have seen all the start positions. It's fantastic, and they have announced the release date for Immortal Empires, which is August 23rd.
Nice.
Which I'm very excited to take a fucking day off work to just play the shit out of.
Very cool. Only other thing from my end is Dark Pathfinder 2e released Dark Archive, which is pretty cool. It's like the big occultist book. They've got like the psychic in it and the thaumaturge. And one thing that I want to highlight, just because it was making the rounds on Twitter, is it's an archetype called Time Mage, which is like very time focused caster thing. And one of the feats you can get is essentially anytime you summon a creature, instead of summoning a creature, you summon an alternate dimension or an alternate timeline version of yourself. And so the devil you summon is you if you had been a devil in an alternate timeline. And the big meme that was showing up, it doesn't technically work with the rules, is like every DM's nightmare. It says summon instrument, and you summon like summoning an instrument version of yourself was making the rounds on Twitter. But it was it's super neat. I love Pathfinder 2e. I've been having a lot of fun playing it. So big recommends to anybody out there for your tabletop gaming needs. Yeah. But with that, I'll lead us into the outro. If you'd like to reach us, tell us any of the things you thought about Too Fast, Too Furious, or Heroin, I guess. You can reach us at subdersplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@subdersplaygames.com. We watch these at twitch.tv where these go out live. You can hang out with our very dedicated fans. And what else? We've got you can rate review us anywhere. These go up on YouTube sometimes, and there's a podcast feed. There's a Patreon too. Support us if you feel like it. We appreciate our Patreons very much. Yeah, but that's everything I have. Buddy, you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else that I am looking to promote.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.